So there is this link between science and authority, and indeed even authority within science. Like this idea of peer review, for example, is given, well, that's what makes something authoritative within the scientific community itself.
Yeah. Well, look, peer review is actually a joke. It's one of the reasons why I get upset with scientific institutions when they claim that peer review is much more than what it is. The average person in the street thinks that peer review is when a piece of science is then sent out to maybe a dozen other scientists, and then they pore over it for months and they redo all the experiments, they redo all the calculations, and then they meet and, and after a long period, a great deal of effort, they pronounce, yes, it looks like it's okay. It's not anything like that. It's literally usually a quick read by a couple of scientists, other scientists who may, in some occasions, even be the original scientist's mates. And none of the data is looked at in any detail in almost all cases. The problem is not that the peer review is so cursory. The problem is that scientific institutions make out that it's much more robust than it is. And that actually is a form of corruption, because they're actually giving the public misinformation about the quality assurance system. So peer review is a quality assurance system. It's a good system. We need it, but it's not the be all and end all. You need to go much further than that to be sure that a piece of science is right.
It appears to a layperson like me, and I'm just going to say something. I'm not asking you to validate. In fact, I'm quite happy for you to invalidate. I just want to explain to you my conceptual framework here. So when we talk about, when lay people like me are concerned that there's corruption in science, my first question, I suppose, would be, is that the case? And the second question is, because the word corruption is linked with malevolent intent, what and how does this corruption, if indeed it does exist, if that's what do you think? What and how does it look like within the scientific community, and to what scale is it? Now, I know that's a lot of questions, so I'm happy for you to continue talking for some time.
Well, the answer is that most of the corruption in science is certainly not malevolent. It's certainly not people taking money, the worst kind. There is corruption in the sense that, arguing from authority. Well, we're the authorities, we will decide what is right, don't listen to anybody else. That is a form of corruption, and scientists should never, ever do that. We should always listen to the other side, even if just to reject it. You often don't need to listen for very long to reject something. But there are other forms of effective corruption. As I mentioned, the peer review system is easily corrupted. It's almost an ideal system for generating groupthink. If the only way I, as a scientist, can get my work published is by having to get other people around me to agree with it, then you can see that, well, we'll all agree together, and somebody who's out on the side will not be able to get their work published. That's a form of corruption, right? It's a minor form. Nobody's doing anything malevolent or anything like that, but the system is not working. It's been corrupted. But there's many, many more. So, for example, and this is a bit worse, it's actually very difficult on some occasions to get the source data out of scientists or companies. I mean, some of the COVID stuff with Pfizer not wanting to release their data, that's a form of corruption. It's often not malevolent, but not as malevolent as fraud, but it means that work can't be properly relied upon. Corruption comes in terms of you've got to go along with the prevailing wisdom in order to get funding. So the funding tends to corrupt the science as well. So there are many ways, but it's very, very rarely outright fraud where somebody just makes something up. I've called, looked at a lot of science which I vehemently disagreed with. And I think on only one occasion am I suspecting outright fraud. The rest is just honest mistakes or a system which is actually forcing people ultimately to be corrupt in a way. I
the way I'm understanding that, and again, I'm just trying to, because I'm not scientifically trained, I'm a layperson, and I want to understand this. So what I'm kind of hearing is fundamentally that's a form of conflict of interest that a person doesn't recognize that they have. What human beings do is they often conflate self-interest with a broader cause, especially if it's a messianic cause.
Yeah, that's right. They're doing it. It's good. It's noble cause corruption is what it is. But the point about no conflict of interest, one of the things that annoys me more than anything else is that, well, I'm often accused of being in the pay of the coal industry. All right, I don't. It's just an accusation that's put around. And in many cases, you'll see my scientific opponents writing stuff up, and at the bottom they'll say, "Do you have any conflicts of interest?" And they'll say, "I have no conflicts of interest." But actually, we've all got a conflict of interest when we're in the system. You have to go along with the prevailing narrative to get your work published and to get funding. If you're stepping too far away from the prevailing wisdom, you will not get funding. So there is a conflict of interest. We've actually all got it, and I have been guilty of that. In some of my Australian Research Council grants, I've been forced into it to say, it is well known the Great Barrier Reef is in diabolical shape, reference, and go on like that. Now, I've actually been guilty of a form of corruption because I didn't actually believe that, but I knew that I had to do that in order to get, my message across in some way. And at the bottom, you could say, well, I don't have any conflict of interest. Well, I do actually, because if I don't get ARC grants, my university is unhappy with me, I might not get a promotion, and all sorts of things are going to happen. So you're forced into this system, and claiming that there's no conflict of interest is actually just straight wrong, though almost everybody does that.
I think I have a degree of understanding of that from two perspectives. So I've just come out of the Queensland Police Service. I had 30 years up. Now, from complete clarity, I never saw anything that would be corruption in the truest sense of the word, like a police officer turning a blind eye to obvious criminality, any sort of criminality for money. I never saw anything like that, and that would be against, the kind of culture and ethos of the service that I was in anyway. However, the noble cause corruption, I never did it. I didn't see anything, or I would have reported it. But I understand the temptation, because if you think someone, and these things can be as seeming imperative. So if it's something as serious as a murder or child sex case, or even down to someone who's doing consistent break and enters, like that doesn't sound like much. It's like, well, break and enters, but it's like, well, no, you're doing massive damage to the community.
Yeah.
Within the system, there is a temptation to go, well, this bit of due process that was put in there to guard this person, it kind of doesn't really apply to them because they are in fact a criminal. That law, that bit of due process isn't protecting an innocent person from an unfair prosecution. We're not locking up one innocent man, and we're getting a dirtbag who needs to get locked up. This kind of needs to happen, and we're the good guys. In fact, we're being brave doing it. I understand that temptation, and it's a hard one to resist.
Yep.
That's why I actually don't indict. I don't indict people too much about this. Like, I'm really careful about kind of like insulting people.
Can I just jump in there, because
please?
One of the things is that if you're in a culture where the temptation is there, but you don't see it, it happens either not at all or very rarely, then it's easier not to get involved in yourself. But when you see it happening all around you, like it's happening in science, then the culture of the organization will probably put you in a position that you will follow along with that. And that's actually what happens in science, that everybody's in a position that you've got to, because the corruption is essentially endemic, this low-level corruption on conflicts of interest and peer review and all the rest of it, it's more or less inevitable that people will get involved with it. And that's a shocking situation. And what we need is sort of like what happened in the 1980s, where I think there was a degree of corruption in the Queensland Police Force.
Yeah, it was.
And we need the Fitzgerald inquiry to go through science. And a lot of people will be, almost all scientists will be very, very happy for that to occur.
And look, you're precisely right, because culture works so well in, our Western culture right now is criminals are afraid of the police and society. But as we've seen is what happens in America. And I can tell you it's happening in Australia too, bit by bit. The frog's being boiled over here as well. If you get the police scared of criminals, and if you get then the broader society scared of criminals. So you've got things completely inverted. Well, I'll tell you who's running society.
Yeah.
You know, and it's kind of, you want to be really careful about that. And I also have a degree of understanding too, because I applied for a Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fellowship and got one. They scraped the bottom of the barrel and up I popped. But I kind of understand. I understand the idea with that too, because the first time I applied, I didn't even get shortlisted, and it was an area that I thought was really important and had national significance, because that's the whole thing with any Churchill Fellowship. It's got to have national significance. But the second time around, like, I had to really incorporate things that I knew would appeal to the zeitgeist of the time. And it's not that I wasn't interested in those things. It's not that I didn't care about those things. It's not that I didn't think that those things weren't important, but it's just that I had to specifically articulate some things to ensure that my fellowship application stood out from the others, because, you know, I mean, we're told, I don't know exactly how many applications there were to people who were selected, but, you know, we're told it's normally somewhere between 100 and 200, you know, applicants. So it's, you've got to, it's like, and you can imagine the person doing the sort of, it's like, no, 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 maybe, no, 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 maybe. And then they're going to do the same sort of thing with the maybe sort of thing. I think, I'm reluctant to say this, but I think I get it. And in fact, I got this when all this stuff about science first came out, because I looked at it because I was still in the police at the time. I was like, no, I get this. This smells like noble cause corruption to me. It looks like no one's being sinister, no one's bad, but people have just, in their own mind, they've just conflated all of those things, and they can't see what they're doing.
Well, I've actually had it stated to me, this noble cause corruption is okay. I was once giving a seminar about what I was thinking about the reef. It's the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, because I've done all this work on sediment. We invented the instruments. We got more measurements on sediment. We could demonstrate that farming, the soil erosion from farming, wasn't damaging the reef. But I said, but, you know, clearly we want to reduce soil erosion. It can be having an effect on the rivers that are flowing in, just not damaging the reef. And a very senior person stood up and said, all right, but, you know, you agree that reducing soil erosion is a good thing. So what does it matter if we exaggerate what's happening on the reef? Because it's still going to have a good cause, because we'll be able to stop the farmers, you know, doing bad practices. And I was almost speechless. You know, I said, well, as a scientist, you're supposed to tell the truth. And in front of a room of 50 people, this was sort of put forward as a, well, why is there's nothing wrong with this effectively noble cause corruption? So it goes on. I can assure you it goes on.
Wow. And for someone to articulate that in front of a room of other people, like, again, looking back in my career, especially in the early 90s, like, I was sworn in 1991. So that was the Fitzgerald inquiry hadn't long finished. Neither had the deaths in custody inquiry. Of course, deaths in custody was actually a great inquiry, because although it showed there was really terrible neglect, like, people of all races were just being, especially in country watch houses, were being thrown in cells, and because they were drunk, and cop would throw some food at them, throw some water at them, see you tomorrow morning, go home, have a sleep, come back tomorrow morning, person is either dead from something that should have been picked up, because, you know, we're talking about vulnerable people who have got, like, serious underlying illnesses that alcohol is masking, or in an alcoholic depression, they killed themselves. The police weren't doing their job. They weren't showing due diligence, and they weren't looking after people in custody, but there was nothing sinister or malicious going on, which in some ways was kind of reassuring. But with Fitzgerald, like, you talk to the really old detectives, and I can kind of say this now because most of the guys that I would have told me this are dead. So even if someone comes and says to me, well, who told you that, you know, in the early 90s, like, the guys used to say, look, it wasn't all of the time, but, like, if we had a serious crook and we didn't have the evidence, and the way it was kind of articulated to me, and I'm pretty much telling you a conversation, words to the effect of that was relayed to me by a couple of who were then senior detectives. They said, look, we didn't do it all the time with everyone. It had to be a serious kind of crime. The guy had to be a proper grub and a proper crook. But you've got to understand, back then, Matt, like, we didn't have forensic science. We didn't have, we just didn't have these tools. There was a right to remain silent. And even back then, like, this was before what we now have the Police Powers Administration Act. even with warning, that was complicated. Like if you warned a suspect too early, like if you just walked up to them and warned them, that could still make everything they said inadmissible, because you're only supposed to warn when you made the decision to charge. Yeah. So what the courts would say was like, well, the reason you warned him was to intimidate him and fair enough, there's nothing sinister about that, Professor. They're just recognizing a human dynamic, and there's probably a degree of truth to it. That's not Codswallop. But what it meant was the police were really hamstrung without going through all the other ways that the police were hamstrung. And they kind of said, well, we were doing our job.
Yeah.
We just had to do it. I really do. I understand this.
Oh yeah, you can understand why this happens. There's no doubt about that. And you need to have some sympathy for why it happens. But you've got to recognize what it actually is.
Absolutely. Now, can we talk about scale? So, because we give science so much authority now, and it's fundamentally the arbiter of disputes. It's like follow the science, follow the science. It has this much authority. You can use a policing analogy if you like how corrupt are the cops? Are they just like, beyond redemption? Is this a small thing? Is this spread right throughout the service? Is it?
I can put a number on that. In terms of how much of them are corrupt in the worst sense, a tiny fraction. But if you look at them in terms of their reliability, how often they get it right, and you're talking about half the time. So, in published findings, when you try to replicate a piece of work that some other scientist has done, when these studies are done, they find very roughly half the time you cannot reproduce that experiment or that study or whatever, right? It's appalling. In some areas where they've done this, so when drug companies often try to replicate promising university research because they might want to see if this chemical that's been invented, cures cancer, as might be claimed by the university, the failure rate is as much as 80%. So you're talking about a failure rate which is way worse than even the worst professions that you could imagine. I mean, politicians tell the truth more than half the time. Used car salesmen, their cars work way more than half the time. All these groups that you would normally regard it as very unreliable, unhappily, they are more reliable than scientists. And that is an appalling thing to say. But ironically, the scientific edifice taken as a whole has been incredibly worthwhile. We're only talking about the newly published work, something that scientists did it last week, publishes it, about half of that is wrong. Newton's laws of motions, Einstein's relativity, and lots of the theories in chemistry and in medicine, utterly rock solid because they've been replicated again and again and again and again. But the newly published work, 50% wrong. Very round figure.
Wow, and that is concerning. And when you link,
it's staggering. It's a staggering statistic, and most people, they just don't believe you when you first say it, and I get it. So for the people who are listening, just Google replication crisis, John Ioannidis, and you will just get thrown up massive amounts of this. This is well known in the scientific fraternity. All the big science organizations know about this statistic. All of the big national science authorities know about this statistic, and they are, to their credit, doing something about it, but in my view, not enough and not fast enough. And
when you link, again, because we're coming back to the kind of like authority thing, when you link it with the fact that science is in some sense the determiner, and it's what policy is guided by. Like if you think of the link between bad science and when I say ignorant, I don't mean I mean politicians who aren't experts in the whatever it is area that they're making policy on, be it climate, be it medicine, be it, fill in anything. There's not one topic that you'd hope wouldn't be informed by science. Indigenous affairs, you name it. So if people are going for a narrative rather than a scientifically based evidence truth, you think of the implications for what that means for us politically, for where Western and the Western world is going.
Yeah, it's astonishing how many things are based on what we think is science, but actually isn't. I mean, yes, follow the science, but make sure that what you think is science actually is science. And there's ways of doing that. You can look at how well it's been tested, how well it's been replicated. In many cases, the replication and testing has been appalling, or when it's done, it's actually demonstrated without doubt that it's wrong. And they still say, follow the science. So, well, actually, that's not right. I mean, at that meeting which we met at the other week, the peer reviewer said, this work is actually wrong. And yet the government was saying, oh, we're following the science, which has been peer reviewed, but they didn't mention, well, actually, the peer reviewer said it was wrong. So that there are many, many instances where, I mean, I think everybody agrees we should follow what we think is a piece of information that's been genuinely tested in a scientific manner, whatever that might mean. But what's actually happening is you've got some good faith politicians, you know, even ones that I'm going to be disagreeing with, who believe that they are following the science. Unfortunately, they have been deceived into thinking something is scientific when it actually wasn't. So I don't blame the politicians under those circumstances. So, for example, with the state government here in Queensland, I don't blame them for making up all the rules, the wrong rules that they've done about the Great Barrier Reef and farmers, because they're following what they think is the science. If I have a criticism, I think that they're a little bit less critical than they could be about looking at that information. Are they being given good information? But if they believe they're following the science, then they're probably making the decisions in good faith.
As things stand, can we trust the scientific community now?
No, you can't. Not until they really fix the replication crisis, not until they finish lying about the reliability of peer review, not until they actually start to spend serious amounts of money on replication of work, not until that they properly prosecute people who are misbehaving in the scientific fraternity. There's all sorts of things that need to be done before you can again say that guy's got a white coat, he's a scientist, pretty likely that he's right? At the moment, you can't really have a great deal of confidence in the new work that is coming out. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. It absolutely does not mean it's wrong. It just means that you don't have the confidence that you really need to have.
So it's not unreasonable following on from that. So if people are questioning, you know, I suppose the scientific consensus around any particular subject, it doesn't mean that they're being unscientific in the true sense of the word.
No, it doesn't. I mean, questioning is fine. But I think if you start questioning Newton's laws of motion, you're going to have some pretty good data because it's so solid. But if it's something that's new, that's come along just in the last, say, couple of years, for instance, yeah, you really need to start questioning and burying deep down, because stuff does get hidden. Peer groups do form. Groupthink does occur. Yeah, we get through that, but questioning is the only way that you do get through it.
The way I'm seeing your career and the way you speak, and I've heard you speak a few times now, I see you as passionate about science. Yeah. Like everyone associates you with climate and all these kind of things, but am I correct in saying, and I really want to know if I'm knowing this right, is that for you, ultimately, it's about a love of science. It's about a love of the process. And yes, the policy implications and everything else concern you. And yes, the implications for, you know, your career, for the profession itself, for the process of science matter. But ultimately, it's about protecting the scientific endeavour, the way
it is. It's about that. It's about making sure that we get to the truth. So it's really about the truth, and the science is about trying to get as close as we can to the truth. That then really worries me when we're making policy decisions based on stuff which you can't, well, in many cases you can tell is not the truth, or at least you can certainly say in many cases that we really don't know enough about it to say whether it's the truth or not. So that's what it's about, and it just annoys me, and you'll find that the people who tend to step out they get really annoyed when they see something that is just not true, all right? And you get annoyed about that. And that's really what's motivated me.